why you should always be an aperture priority. So I can remember back to when I first started shooting years and years ago, and I was in automatic, which I'm going to tell you not to be in automatic. Shooting in automatic, and I would look through the viewfinder and see the numbers in there, and I had a grasp on what shutter speed was. You know, you see the 500 or the 250. But then there was that little number next to it, which was the aperture, which I had no idea what that number was. And it wasn't until I really found the time to sit down and spend time figuring out, learning what aperture is and what it means and what that number does and how it affects your images, that I really felt like for the first time, like I understood something about photography, something deeper than just a point and shoot, point your camera at something and take a picture. I really understood photography more than the people around me. And I think a lot of people probably have the same experience. You know, a lot of the settings with the camera, especially now when everything's really automatic and you have cameras on your phones, a lot of the settings are easy to understand. Shutter speed is a shutter speed. ISO is a concept, but you kind of get in dark situations, you need a high ISO. And then, low light, it's all automatic. It happens automatically. But aperture is more of a concept. It's more of an abstract thing in photography that you don't see in regular life. So for the most part, I think with a lot of people, same as me, once you understand aperture, it's kind of like the doorway. It's the gateway to really understanding how to be more creative, how to control your images, and kind of how to take your photography to the next level. So why should you be shooting an aperture priority? Well, it definitely gives you more control. Now I know you might say that, well, shoot in manual. Manual gives you the most control you can possibly have. And while that's true, there's a lot of things that you can let the camera do for you automatically that don't really take away from the kind of control that you're having. We've done a video about auto ISO and how great that is to use, and letting the camera take control of other parts of your photography, keeping an eye on it, keeping an eye on your shutter speed, keeping an eye on your ISO is important. But for the most part, exposure, let the camera get it right. Sometimes you have to take over and do some exposure compensation. But aperture is the place where you really want to control the look and feel of your image. And while shutter speed can be important to control in a lot of situations, especially if you want to blur, you want to take long exposures and blur your images, there's a lot less situations where you need to have that control. There's not really ever a big difference between shooting at a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. Unless in some certain situations. If you're shooting sports, you want to freeze action, or you're shooting long exposures, want to get some nice flowy waterfalls or fireworks or something, you want to capture movement. But those are specific situations. In general shooting, shutter speed is shutter speed. It is what it is. It's going to be fast enough. If your lighting is good enough, it's going to be fast enough to capture the image that you want to capture. But it's not going to have any impact on the quality, the look and feel of your image. So what exactly is aperture? Well, aperture means opening, and in photography it refers to the opening in your lens that allows light through. And you can control that opening and make it wider or smaller depending on what you're trying to do. The thing to understand the concept is what the numbers mean, what the settings mean. A wide aperture, where that opening is wide open, letting a lot of light through, is represented by a smaller number like f2, f2.8, even smaller, f1.4. And if you close that hole down to a smaller opening, it's a larger number, f16, f11. So once you have the concept, once you understand how that works, numerically, it becomes second nature. You know what that number means, you know what it is. But then understanding how to control your image with that is really the biggest difference I find in my photography, and a lot of you people probably have the same experience, is really the key to controlling your creativity. So a wide aperture, an aperture of like 1.4, where the lens is wide open, letting a lot of light in. Not only does it let a lot of light in, but it also controls the depth of field. So the depth of field basically referring to the amount of your image that is in focus. So a large depth of field will have everything in focus from a foot or two in front of the camera until all the way off in the distance. A shallow depth of field, only a thin sliver of your image will be in focus. So if you're shooting a person and they're 3 or 4 feet away from you, they're going to be in focus. Everything else will be out of focus. Everything in front of them, everything behind them will be out of focus. So that's with a wide aperture. You can create an image like that where you have a shallow depth of field and your focus is really just on one thing. And then maybe when you're shooting landscapes and you want to get everything in focus, from the rocks or the flowers in the foreground to the mountains in the distance, you're going to close your aperture down to a small opening, a large number like 16, and get everything in focus. And you'll see, once you start doing that, once you start changing your aperture from one image to the next and seeing how it works, you're really going to start to see how that affects your images, and it's really going to start to change the way that you photograph. So the recommendation is shoot in aperture priority mode. It doesn't have to be shutter priority, manual. Shoot in aperture priority all the time, because the first thing you're going to want to control every time you take an image, the first thing you want to hit is your aperture. You want to make sure you have that first, and then check your settings, make sure everything else is good, make sure your shutter speed is fast enough, and everything else will fall into place. Make sure the first thing you want to make sure is that your aperture is set the way that you want it. So especially if you've been shooting in auto or program mode, get out of that, put it in aperture priority, and get out there and test things out. Take one image multiple times using different apertures, see how it affects everything, see what the difference is between a wide aperture and a small aperture and how it affects your image. And like I said, for me, that's the starting point. That's the gateway for all my images, is getting the aperture right. And that's why for me, aperture is the single most important setting for your camera. Make sure you get your aperture right, and in 9 out of 10 cases, I'm starting with that, and everything else is falling into place. So I hope you found that interesting. If you agree or disagree or have anything else to add, put it in the comments below. We love to hear from you. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Why you should always be an aperture